Hello, I'm Hannah Kay, and welcome to this Intelligence Squared event with Mohsin Hamid. There are various ways in which you can get involved. You can ask questions, join in the audience chat, and tweet us using the hashtag IQ2. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a books tab where you can get a discounted copy of Mohsin's acclaimed new novel, The Last White Man, and it is a compelling and rather unsettling read. A quick look ahead at some of our in-person events here in London before we start. On October the 17th, we're going to be looking at Ukraine through the lens of history, and we have Max Hastings, Margaret Macmillan, and Peter Frankopan in conversation with the BBC's Johnny Diamond. And then we have a big debate on the motion Sanctions Against Russia Won't Work, and that's taking place on November the 22nd. And if you want to hone your own debating skills, you may want to join us on November the 24th, when we have the firebrand journalist Mehdi Hassan, and he's going to be in conversation with broadcaster John Humphreys on how to win every argument. If you're a subscriber, you can get a 15% discount on all our in-person tickets. But now back to tonight, and I'm delighted to hand over to our chair. She is a BBC broadcaster and journalist, Razia Iqbal.
Hannah, thank you very much. Welcome to this Intelligence Squared event with me, Razia Iqbal, in conversation with Mohsin Hamid, best-selling novelist. We're speaking to Mohsin from Lahore, where it is late. Thank you so much for being with us, Mohsin. Mohsin's books include two novels which were shortlisted for the Booker Prize, The Reluctant Fundamentalist and Exit West. And we're going to talk today about his fifth novel, The Last White Man. I'm always reluctant, Mohsin, to give away the plot of novels because I think it's so important that people should go out and buy them and read them or go to libraries and borrow them. But your title gives a fair bit away. Tell us first what it was that was the impulse of this book, because it's quite clear that Kafka, with the Metamorphosis, is an inspiration, as is the novel Blindness by the Portuguese writer José Saramago. But tell us what made you want to write The Last White Man?
I think that, well, first of all, hello, Razia, and thanks for having me. I think that the novel comes in a way from my own lived experience of having lived half my life in the West and half in the East. So I'm 51, and I've lived almost half of that time in Pakistan, the rest in the US and the UK. And in the year 2001, I was 30 years old. And I had lived in the Bay Area of California, in Boston, and New York City. Had gone to these elite universities and had a well-paying job. And I was aware of discrimination in American Western society. But if you'd asked me whether discrimination was one of the main challenges that I faced in my life, I would have probably said no. I had a well-paying job, and I'd gone to these sort of elite universities. I was living in this cosmopolitan city. And then on September 11th, 2001, when the terrorist attacks happened, I suddenly experienced a pretty profound change in how people were looking at me. And so I was being, held at airports and given additional screening, and you'd fly into JFK and they'd put you in a small room for a few hours and ask you all these questions about combat training. You'd have to go register your address and where you were going to be staying in the city. People on the tube or on buses would sort of be a bit freaked out if you came unshaven with a backpack. And so I experienced this sense that, suddenly my position had changed, that people were reading a kind of ethnicity, a sort of racial identity, a kind of Muslim racial identity onto me with a very different meaning than how they had read me before. And I wrote a novel about this called Reluctant Fundamentalist, which deals very specifically with the mutual suspicion between people of a Muslim background and Pakistan and the West. But the underlying question of how one's race can, in a sense, be authored upon you, how one can suddenly find oneself in a very different position, remained. and that eventually found its way really into this book.
And the book opens with the character Anders, and I want to talk about the name in a moment. But it starts with him waking up in a modern city, not easily identifiable, and he discovers that he's no longer white, but he's brown, and it becomes quickly apparent that pretty much everyone in the place that he lives is going in that direction. So let's, having outlined exactly what happens at the beginning, let's talk about the name. So Anders, of course, makes me think immediately of Anders Breivik, the white supremacist Norwegian who killed something like 70 young people in an island just off Norway. A really horrific event. It also means different in German. And so tell us first why you chose to give this character that name.
Well, Anders, as you say, it means sort of different or stranger. It can also mean manly. It has, its roots are found in different European languages, different variations on that Ander start. The ANDR root is, in a sense, at the very heart of man. And so I like the idea of this manly man, or this man called man. The name is both a sort of cipher onto which you can write any human being, but it's also tonally charged in the sense that it seems to come from some older place, a kind of place of whiteness, a primeval source from whence the rest of whiteness might flow. And of course, that's just a bit of a suggestion, a bit of a hint. But I found that, for example, in The Russian Fundamentalist, without giving the protagonist Cengiz any real aspects of Muslim religiosity, it was possible to evoke a sort of feeling of Islam in people just with a particular way of speaking. And similarly, I think Anders was meant to evoke a certain sense of whiteness, really just through a name.
Hmm. And the idea that he should turn brown and it becomes a sort of epidemic, if you like, makes him patient zero. And I want to really talk to you about what it was that you wanted to explore specifically, because there are relationships that he has with a girlfriend, with his father, with well, not so much his relationship with his girlfriend's mother, but we see lots of personal relationships being played out against this backdrop of this really quite shocking thing that's happening to this small group of characters who are all white, and eventually, except for one of them, they all become brown. And I wonder what it was that you wanted people to think about this in the context of something that you have said before, which is the point of writing is in order to be able to say something in an urgent way. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it. You said it much more pithily, but I wonder what it was that you wanted to say that felt so important to you that you framed it in the way that you have in this novel.
Well, the novel, as you just said, the novel is, in a sense, made up of three love stories. A love story between Anders and Una, his girlfriend, between Anders and his father, who is old and profoundly unwell, is in fact dying over the course of the novel, and Una and her mother. And Una's mother is really believes quite strongly that there's in a sense, a plot against people like her, against white people. In a sense that they're being replaced, in the sense that they're being marginalized. And so these three characters and their relationships, sort of triangle of three love stories, is at the heart of the book. In terms of what was the urgent or the urgency in telling this story, or why I was drawn to that, I think a few years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, before the Brexit vote and before the Trump election, if you'd asked me where I thought the West was going on race, probably have answered that I thought that, racism was an ongoing and very serious concern, but the direction of travel was positive. And just before I began writing this book, we had the Brexit vote in the UK, we had the election of Trump in the United States, and it seemed that an entirely different future was sort of heaving into view, one where race was going to become much more important, where the idea of whiteness was going to become much more central to Western politics. And I think partly in response to that, I felt the urgency to write this. And then in terms of those three love stories and why it's this intergenerational love stories above all, is I think that one of the things that we see in countries like the UK and like the US is a breakdown of the generational compact. That if we had imagined that in human history, that the duty of an elder generation is sort of to pass on to a younger generation a better life, that is very thoroughly being betrayed, because we're seeing an elder generation pass on a despoiled environment, a stuttering economy, rampant indebtedness, and the withdrawal of things that the elder generation would have taken for granted: cheap education, relatively cheap housing, the chance of retiring with a good pension. And so I think it struck me that it's possible that this breakdown is to do with the fact that that the elder generation no longer thinks of young people as their young people, that there's been a kind of break between the generations. And so I wanted to tee up a kind of intergenerational love story as a way of exploring both the nature of this phenomenon and also whether it's possible to find antidotes to this phenomenon.
There is, as a result of what happens in the story, violence in the city, and you don't identify where this is. Originally, I thought, well, Anders must be somewhere in Europe, and then because of the violence and the readily available guns that appear, I thought, oh, well, he must mean America, especially in the context of, the conspiracy of the Great Replacement Theory, to which you allude, that one of the characters, Una's mother, clearly adheres to, but also the whole big notion of demographics and how the changes in the United States in particular, it's quite likely that by 2050, which really is not that far away, America is likely to be a minority white country. And I wondered how much you were thinking about the sheer demographics of this as well, informing the story.
I was. I think that that the future of a multiracial majority minority America is quite terrifying to a lot of people, and understandably so. I think that if you were to look at any community that defines itself as an ethnicity or as a group and has thought of itself as a majority, and is in the process of becoming a minority. You can look at the transition of the population, in Lebanon, for example, or you can look at many other places where one ethnic group was previously predominant, or one religious group, and suddenly its numbers have dwindled relative to others. It isn't an easy thing. So I think that there is a real sense of crisis in some people about this change. And so in a way, I wanted to explore, I guess, what you might call this sort of idea of a racial apocalypse, and to ask, whether it need be thought of as apocalyptic. Is there a way for us to imagine it somewhat differently? Because Una's mother, who imagines that white people, will be replaced, in a way is right, because in the course of the novel, of course, everybody, does turn dark. And so whiteness, as she thinks of it, does cease to exist. And this has happened to people again and again. I remember when I was, younger, seeing, young Anglo-Indians or even young British people who had stayed on in Pakistan, after 1947, after independence, after partition, and who were sort of watching this new world, come into existence, and sort of baffled in a way by that world. And as I get older myself, I find that kind of bafflement hitting me as well. I sometimes look at political developments in Pakistan or Britain or America, and I do feel a bit baffled by the changes that are going on. And so, in that sense, it was the idea was to write that from the inside, not to observe Una's mother and these characters from the outside, but to sort of write them from within, without any non-white character standing in for my point of view or for the audience's point of view to say, okay, well, this is how I should think about the situation. Instead, we have 4 white characters, or people who think of themselves as white, and there are only reference points on the journey of the story.
It is so fascinating to be in their shoes, and this idea of white people giving up some of their privilege. I mean, the presumption is that they have privilege to begin with, and then they give up their privilege, that it could be a liberation towards living in a completely different way it's so open. And yet there are people who would argue and have, particularly on social media. I tweeted tonight that one of the things that I love about you is that you're not on social media, which is just this kind of crazy, intense bubble of a world, who are arguing that you are being racist. But what I think is interesting about that accusation is that you're actually trying to, it seems to me, do something completely opposite. You're trying to say that there is a more open, more generous way of thinking about these things, and this novel is a contribution to that debate.
Yeah, well, I think that race is something that we have imagined into existence. So race is not like a physical phenomenon like rain or like the sunrise. Race is something that is relatively new in human history, at least the way we think of it today. The ancient Greeks would not have thought of race in the way that we think of race. And even as recently as what's called the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, when the Muslim rulers of Spain were eventually defeated and pushed out after many centuries of rule by Catholic Christian monarchs. The primary question that was being asked wasn't, your racial identity. The question being asked was, are you a Muslim or a Jew, or are you a Christian? If you were a Muslim or a Jew, you needed to convert or leave or be punished in some way. And if you were a Christian, you needed to stay. Very quickly, that mutated, and there became a question of, well, what about if people are secretly still Muslim and Jewish, and pretending to be Christian? And so, about 500 years ago in human history, in European history, we have this beginning of asking, well, where did you come from? Are you descended from North Africans? Are you descended from non-Christian stock? And on the basis of that, blood comes into play, and then it becomes, well, there's something different about being descended from North Africa and descended from Europe. And then that comes to affect the colonial enterprise that launches forth from the Iberian Peninsula, Columbus, etc., as the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then subsequently the British and French and others sail around the world and say, well, are you of European stock or not? And if not, then we can colonize you. But this system is only a few hundred years old. At the time of Andalusia as a sort of Muslim principality or kingdom, it was really a religious question and not a racial question. So even in modern history, we're talking about a few hundred years. I think it's quite likely a few hundred years from now, we will again not think of race in the terms that we think of it today. So if it's this thing we've imagined into existence, I think it can be interesting in fiction to destabilize it, to say, what happens if it becomes difficult for us to sort people by race. That isn't, I think, a racist proposition. The novel doesn't suggest that there's some fundamental essence of whiteness or some fundamental characteristic of which all white people partake. It talks instead, or it explores instead, a story where it's impossible to tell who is or was white and who isn't. And I think that has, of course, it is struck some people as objectionable in different ways. For some, it's objectionable because it's been argued that the book sort of advocates this anti-white or sort of white genocide kind of a position, which is completely absurd. Without giving too much away, there are four main characters in the book. All of them are white. None of them is killed. One dies of natural causes, and the rest make it happily to the end. It's not a book about the genocide of white people at all. It's the book about the demise of an idea. And on the other hand, there's a sort of I guess objection that it doesn't, in a sense, judge these characters. It doesn't give voice to a person of color. It doesn't give us any characters, who aren't white as primary characters. And to that, I think, my response is that, all of my other novels, except for this one, are almost entirely populated by non-white characters. So it's not that it happened by accident. The reason for doing it was I thought if I created a non-white character, I would be inclined to let that character sort of step in to allow me to look at these white characters from the outside. And also allow the audience to say, the reader to say, okay, well, the way this non-white character is viewing things is how I should view things. I thought it would be, in a sense, much more interesting to give neither myself nor the audience a character into whom we could place our sense of judgment, that to inhabit as best as one can these other personalities and to see, what happens with that. So yeah, I think the book for me is destabilizing to the idea of race, but I would regard it as sort of the opposite of racist myself.
It's interesting because there is a non-white character in it, but the relationship that Anders has with this person, a man whose name he doesn't know and he's never really spoken to him, and in a way it forces him to think about himself and in a slightly different way. So I want to talk a little bit about two things now, really. First of all, the identity politics into which this novel has been thrown, which it inevitably will, because of the way we think about race. And you've articulated so well the construct that it is. But the novel does live in the 21st century, and the 21st century right now is one where identity politics is riven with rage and anger and a kind of polarization that is so problematic. And I wonder how you cope with that as a writer, because you're obviously a writer who deals in ideas but also in telling a story that allows us to imagine things differently, which is, of course, one of the roles of the novel. How do you sit in this world, given that you are a kind of hybrid creature yourself? You live in Pakistan, but you have also lived in the West, in this country, and in New York. How do you navigate all of that?
Well, I think that for me, the one of the experiences that comes from having lived in Pakistan and other places is I tend to see similar trends pretty much everywhere unfolding. That is that almost everywhere we are seeing the rise of some sort of charismatic populist figure who talks about the real people of the country, the true people, how they are threatened by those who are not the real people, and how we must adopt a kind of nostalgic politics that looks at the past as our greatest time, and we must go back to that past. And that can characterize sort of, Donald Trump in the United States. It can characterize many of the, Brexiteers in Britain. It characterizes Erdogan in Turkey and Modi in India and Putin in Russia. It's true of, Bolsonaro and the Taliban. And I mean, it seems that at this moment, we are being very much tempted by a kind of nostalgic politics. And for me, that's very dangerous. So I find it dangerous in part because obviously we can't go back. And secondly, the past was not as good as we might imagine. The golden age of sort of 1950s America, or 1970s, 60s Britain, or of Hinduism and India before Muslims arrived 1,000 years ago. The classical age of Islam. I mean, all of these things, in a sense, are domains that we don't know very well, and we imagine onto them some sort of beauty. But they were unlikely to work very well with our contemporary, mixed societies. Now, what that suggests to me is that it's necessary to, as a storyteller, to imagine what might be non-nostalgic narratives. What might be ways in which we can reclaim the future as a place of hope. And I don't think that one does that really as a kind of naive gesture that everything is just going to work out. I think it's different. I think it's instead that unless we do this, unless we engage in trying to imagine futures that are actually inclusive and desirable, we are going to be left without any prospect of an optimistic future. And therefore, inevitably, peddlers of nostalgia are going to sort of win this political contest. Now, in terms of the anger and heat of identity politics, I think that that racism and violence against minorities is profound and widespread in almost every society, but to different degrees. I don't mean to suggest that, if we suddenly all just say, look, there's no such thing as race, that racism goes away. But I think that it's worth seeing if we can build different kinds of stories to include ourselves. An example of that is, if you have a story that can encompass diverse peoples, very often you find that people can live together with relatively little violence. So, Roman Empire, or the Soviet Union, or Ottoman Empire, or even India pre-partition. You had all types of people living together, not, I would say, in peace, but certainly in incredibly less conflict than after those entities broke apart into sort of feuding, ethnocentric visions. And so one of the dangers, I think, for me about any cosmopolitan, diverse society is if we get into a situation where it is simply about power, where groups are competing for control and status on the basis of raw power, then you descend into a sort of civil strife situation very, very quickly. And, having lived next to Afghanistan for half of my life, no one should wish for their society to descend into that kind of strife. Now, that doesn't mean that we should all just sort of, roll over and say we accept, racism and discrimination and whatnot. But it does mean that we will need to find narratives that allow us to get to more inclusive, less racist futures that don't depend on a battle of all against all. And for me, the novel, really is, in a sense, about that. How do you imagine your way through this?
You mentioned storytelling. So I want to actually, before I ask that question, I meant to say at the beginning that people should be asking their own questions, and I didn't need to because there are lots. So once I've asked you this question, we're going to go to some of the audience questions. As a storyteller, you are enormously inventive, and that sounds like a kind of obvious thing to say, but actually each of your novels is quite different in terms of the forms that you use, let alone the language. I mean, you're quite identifiable as Mohsin Hamid in every single one of those novels, but you know, The Reluctant Fundamentalist is a novel which is a kind of dramatic monologue. Exit West has a kind of fable quality to it, and there's a kind of self-help quality to how to get rich, filthy rich in rising Asia. And in this novel, it seems to me that there's a kind of incantatory feel to it, that there is a kind of repetition, a slowness without, you know, it's a slim novel. It's only about 175, 180 pages long, but there is something so powerful in being with these pages where you just read things again and again without it being in any way, the repetition doesn't mean that it's in any way boring, but that sense of saying things again in a very simple way is such a powerful thing given the subject matter. And I want to ask you really about the way in which you play with language in each of your, and form in each of your novels, and really about how you started out as a writer. Now, I know that you taught, you were at Princeton and you were taught by the great Toni Morrison, who is a heroine of mine. So I really want to ask you about that relationship, learning to be a writer, because you really are quite inventive as the mature writer that you're becoming.
Well, so when I went to college in the States, I had no idea that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know that you could study creative writing. I actually didn't wind up really studying creative writing, but I took 4 creative writing courses among the 30-odd courses I took as an undergraduate. And 2 of those were with Joyce Curloats, who was, you know, a fantastic teacher. And the final of the 4 was a long fiction workshop with Toni Morrison. And she would pick, I think, half a dozen students every year to do this workshop. And instead of handing in a few stories, you would hand in one longer story, and then you'd revise it. So I wrote the entire first draft of my novel, you know, for this class, and I, you know, I feel bad for her now. It was probably a huge imposition. So you're expecting, you know, 40 pages, and this kid hands in sort of 200, and then he revises it, hands it in again. But you know, she was very kind and very generous, and so she would read our work, all of us, and she took it very seriously. And you know, my most prized literary possession is that first manuscript of my first novel, with her sort of notes, handwritten in this gorgeous fountain pen handwriting. She both wrote beautifully, not as a writer. Of course, she wrote beautifully as a writer, but she wrote longhand.
Yeah, she used to write on those kind of yellow foolscap notebooks. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I think that I mean, it was my handwriting is atrocious, and I sort of block print in, you know, capital letters, and so I think the gap between our handwritings was probably about the same as the gap between our understanding of what writing was. But she would, you know, she spent the time to like read this manuscript, to mark it up, you know, did that twice, and every year she would pick a student to read from the class, and that year she picked me to read from the class. But I think the most important thing was that, you know, she made it possible for her students to imagine that they could be writers. And that is, in a sense, perhaps the biggest gift any writer can give to another. That, you know, if a writer of her stature is reading your work, taking it seriously, you begin to think, you know, maybe I can actually do this. And she taught many things. I mean, she read our stuff out loud, and she encouraged us to do that. You know, to this day, my writing days are spent typically about 2/3 of the days pacing around, reading out loud what I've written, and 1/3 is actually typing into my, you know, computer. and she taught, various other lessons. But I think the idea that she opened up permission to imagine that one was a writer, because I didn't know any writers growing up. I didn't have friends who were novelists or family friends who were novelists. I read lots of books, but I didn't know anybody who wrote them. And so for me, that was quite an incredible experience. Out of that, I guess, came 6 or 7 years of revising that first novel, which became Moth Smoke, which I wrote one way and another way. It became a trial. I went to law school, and I, kept working on it. Basically, not a single sentence was in common with that first draft, and it became my law school thesis as this. And then I got a job in New York, and I was still working on my first novel. And it was, it was a very strange, I guess, thing that each year I would write another novel on the exact same topic with the exact same characters, and I would call it a draft, but it would be profoundly different. And I was basically teaching myself how to write that novel. And then when it came to Button Fundamentalists, the same thing happened. 7 years, 7 drafts, numerous approaches that didn't work, until I figured out that it could be this dramatic monologue that was being told in Lahore about events in New York. And so we were simultaneously in Pakistan and America, at the same time, with this American interlocutor who never gets to speak. So we have this one-sided narrative that the reader has to sort of balance. And then in the How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, I was trying, in a way, having moved back to Pakistan, to de-exoticize my own perspective, and to deny myself the impulse of representation by writing a novel with no names. It's not set in a place with names, with there was no Islam, no Pakistan. The characters had no names. And I thought, it's important for me to see things for myself and to describe them without using these sort of brands, because Pakistan, is a brand. It means certain things. When you write about Muslims, or you write about a character with this name, those mean certain things. I thought, let me write a novel that doesn't do that. And then Exit West, in a sense, it was rooted in a way in children's literature. And I thought, I want to write a novel where the decoder ring for the novel is built into the book. In other words, unlike my previous novels that were fundamentally untrustworthy, they said one thing and meant something else. And in that gap, the reader had to, I guess, interpret their own version of the book. I thought, in Exit West, let me just say what I mean. And I thought, how do you do that? And who does that well? And I thought, oh, well, children's books actually do that really well. And so, in a sense, it took on a form that was very much informed by that. And when I got to The Last White Man, I thought, how is this going to work? And so I thought, one thing I want to do is I want to have all of the characters, in a sense, think of themselves as white. I want to engage in this imaginative act, where if we consider that, fiction can have, in a sense, a representative impulse, where I'm telling my story, or the story of people that I think of as like myself. And that's a very important impulse, particularly when certain kinds of stories have been sort of systematically erased, or not been allowed to be told. But there's another kind of impulse, which is, in a sense, a transgressive impulse, the impulse of being something else. A little boy being a T-Rex, a little girl being a boy, or being somebody who isn't you. And I think that's a hugely important part of fiction, is we get to be people who aren't us as readers, but also potentially as writers. And so I thought, let me, with as much sympathy as I can manage, and as empathy as I can manage, be these characters, write them from the inside. And then in terms of the sentences, I guess the last thing I'll say is that the novel took on these very long sentences that you really use only commas as punctuation marks, and sort of repeat things and build up a kind of rhythm as you're reading, hopefully, a kind of oral rhythm. And the reason for that is that, in a sense, you encounter these ideas as a reader. You may not be comfortable with or necessarily like those ideas, but because there's no full stop, you just keep moving forward. And you, in a sense, have passed the idea by the time you get to pause and reflect. And so the novel keeps bearing you forward, hopefully. It postpones the moment of critical analysis and allows the sort of emotional impact to happen first.
In talking about the most recent book, you've brought us full circle to the questions that the audience have for you. This is from Stella. In the novel, you're not very specific about how people actually look when they go from being white, light-skinned, to dark. Was that deliberate?
Yeah, the novel is intentionally not specific about lots of things. So only Anders and Una have names. What they look like when they become dark isn't clear. What country this is, what city this is, what's really happening in the background. We don't know all of that stuff. And the reason for that is I really do believe that one of the important, distinguishing features of written fiction, of our main mass-produced storytelling modes, we have television and cinema, which are modes that look like the world. So people look like people, and cars look like cars, and Lahore looks like Lahore, and New York looks like New York. And we are viewers of a world that looks like our world. But when we read a book, we look at something that looks nothing like the world. It's letters, spaces, and punctuation marks against a white field. And we readers create a world out of that. The creative act of reading is enormously more than of viewing a film or a television show. And readers create the novels that they're reading. They co-create them alongside the writers who write them. And so I don't think that, in a sense, when a reader reads my book, they're just reading my book. I think what's happening is the reader and I are jointly imagining into existence an experience. And so I try to write books that leave a lot of space for readers to imagine their version of it. People have said, oh, this is set in America, or it's set in Britain, or it's set in Norway, or it's set in South Africa. Why did you do that? And I said, I actually didn't do that. You did that. You set the book there. The book doesn't say where it's set. Why does that just become...
It's such a wonderful amount of agency you're giving the reader. I mean, I've often thought about what a reader brings to a novel, and you've articulated it so wonderfully.
Well, it's the thing about it, which I think is really interesting, is that, when we read a novel, it's one of the very few times that we get to, as adults, really play make-believe in the way that we did as kids. You're playing house, or you're playing pirate, you're playing whatever. You read a novel, and that's what you're doing. It might seem to you that it's something, much more banal and much more innocent. The writer is simply presenting you with the story. But that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is you are entering into this make-believe world, and you're making it, in fact. Yeah. You are seeing things, and you are feeling things, and you're having bodily sensations, and you're smelling things. And so for me, when it comes to race, it's a very interesting domain, because race is such an uncomfortable topic, really, for all of us. And so for a reader to be allowed to have an imaginative experience with the privacy of being alone with your imagination, to me feels, very worthwhile, as something that one should hope that we could do, because it lets us enter into this racial domain, experience it, as infuriating, uplifting, upsetting, confusing, whatever that experience is, all of the above, and then reckon with it. Because, in a sense, the novel doesn't tell you how to judge these characters or judge these events. It doesn't even entirely tell you how to make them, but you do make them. And then, in a sense, you need to judge what you make. It's impossible to escape the idea of, how do I feel about this? And how do I feel about these people? And when you get to do that by yourself, I think that we can be honest in a way that we don't get to be in the performative self that we adopt when we're dealing with other people.
Mm. So the next question from Bobby actually is connected, and you have, I think you've answered it during the course of our conversation. So Bobby's asking if the book is a plea for a post-racial future where race doesn't count. Is that what you're saying, or are you trying to jolt people into realizing how much race matters?
I can't say that I could really reduce the book to sort of either of those two impulses. I think as a reader, I could see that you might read the book as an invitation into a post-racial future, or you might read the book as a way to sort of show us just how much race matters. I think my task is slightly different. My task is I want to imagine being these people. Can I do that? What does it take for me to try as a writer to be these characters, to feel what they feel, and in a sense, to give a sense of dignity to feelings of loss, even if the thing that is being lost is not something that I might think of as good. In other words, these are characters grappling with the loss of a kind of identity and a belief system and a way of being in the world. Now, I might not approve of that identity and belief system, but I can still hopefully appreciate the strength of that feeling of loss. And so for me, that was really something I wanted to do. Is for the reader, I think it's not so clear. It's up to you really as a reader as to what you want to do with this book. But it's a book about, what do you make, I suppose, of my attempt as somebody who's not white to write these white characters. What do you make of their attempt to navigate this world? Do you find truth in it, or do you find a lack of truth in it? What resonates, what doesn't resonate? Do you feel sympathetic or horrified? It's less that there's, I suppose, a message, and more there's an invitation to play a kind of make-believe that might teach us a little bit more about ourselves.
Yeah, I suppose to be willing to feel unsettled in some ways, to be open to the idea of feeling discombobulated by the ideas. There's a question here from Kai. Why do you never use the term black in the book? I mean, you say dark-skinned, you say brown. Were you envisaging a world where all races merge into one?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting, right? In the sense that these are characters who think of themselves as white. Now, whether there is such a thing is a very interesting question. We can believe in whiteness, some of us or all of us, and whether we believe in it or not, it can have enormous power. Just as a religion that we don't believe in can still have enormous power over us when its believers act upon us in certain ways. But it's not that, in a sense, the characters are going from one race to another in the novel, that we are saying that there was this race called white, and then there is this new race called black. Rather, the novel is what happens if our ability to sort one another by race breaks down? What if we're unable to figure out what race people are? And so in that sense, all we know is these people become darkened, and it's difficult for them to figure out, who is and who isn't what. To me, it was more about, in a sense, the arrival of something scrambling our sorting mechanism, our racial sorting mechanism, than saying a new race is born, be it a black race or a white race that we all belong to. So I left it intentionally vague. But many readers have told me that they think that the characters became black, and they talk about how the characters became black or brown or whatever, and that's sort of a reader's reading of the book.
This is a question from Mitzi. I mean, we kind of talked a little about the kind of political, the big geopolitical picture that was the impulse for the novel. But the question is, what are your thoughts about the racial reckoning of 2020? And I'm assuming that it's a reference to the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. This is from Mitzi. Does it give you grounds for hope?
Well, I think that I was in Pakistan for most of 2020, and it was remarkable how much people in Pakistan were following events of the United States, that summer and that year. The protests were on the news. People were talking about it. People were messaging each other about it. There was this wonderful truck art that got forwarded around about, George Floyd on the back of a Pakistani truck, written in Urdu. And in many ways, America does have this ability to catalyze, conversations around the world. In the same way that, for example, when Muhammad Ali, the boxer I'm talking about now, decided to not fight in Vietnam. Well, first of all, he became a Muslim, which was enormously important, I think, to people in this part of the world. But also, he chose not to fight in Vietnam. And took this sort of principled stance and went to jail for taking that stance. It had an incredible effect, I think, on people. One of the very few sports figures that my children knew about who was no longer alive was Muhammad Ali. I mean, they heard about him starting out in life. And so, in a sense, I think the impact of now my book was, I think, already well along by 2020. So I was already working on this particular book. But I thought that, in a sense, highlighting the incredible injustice and horrific violence that is happening on racialized lines in the United States was important. But it was also important to view that not just as an opportunity to say, oh, well, we are the good guys, but to say, for example, in Pakistan, to what extent is violence against non-Muslim religious minorities something similar to what is being meted out to African Americans in the United States? And in India, similarly, violence against Muslims in India, which is taking on increasingly horrific proportions. And in really countries around the world, in the sense that on the one hand, there was a chance to, I suppose, to say that this is another example of white oppression, which all post-colonial societies will have experienced, almost all. But the other part of it was, to what extent are those of us who belong to what we imagine to be majorities in our countries guilty of perpetrating similar kinds of violence or violence with similar echoes in different contexts? And that I thought was an incredibly, I guess, eye-opening moment, not just for looking at the United States, but for looking at Pakistan, for example.
There's one final question. The person doesn't name themselves. You write a lot about grief in the novel, the loss of a child, a sibling. Is this something that you've experienced yourself?
The novel is very much about grief. And I think that what's happened in contemporary culture is that we have, in a sense, turned away from reckoning with grief. In recent days, there's been the funeral of the Queen, Queen Elizabeth, and so of course we've seen so much about the death of this person. But generally speaking, we avert our gaze from death, and we avert our gaze from loss. And we are living in a hyper-capitalist world where we are encouraged to consume, that our self is what's most important, and our self expresses itself through consuming things. And this, of course, leaves us completely vulnerable to the human predicament, which is that the self is temporary and that it ends, and that all of us go. And in the past, we had all sorts of cultural, religious, clan, tribal, folk modes of dealing with the passage of the stages of life. When I moved from London to Lahore, one of the biggest differences was in London, I never went to a funeral. And in Lahore, rarely a month went by where I didn't go to a funeral. Being in a society with extended family, and you're suddenly thrust into the rituals of death in a different way. But so for me, I think our terror of loss and our terror in the face of loss is part of what is crippling us, politically and imaginatively at this moment. And so it's worth, in a sense, thinking about other modes of approaching that. And so one of the, I guess, themes in the novel is really the way in which Anders' father, who in a sense is the last white man in the novel, approaches the idea of his own death, and approaches it as an opportunity to give something to his son. And I think that idea, the idea that the things that we cling to, our beings, ourselves, that these things die, and that there are better and worse ways for that to happen, is important. And so as we imagine the futures of our societies, there's one which is, well, if it's not going to be the way I like, I'm going to tear it down and take it with me, which I think is a kind of rant that we hear in a lot of politics today. If I can hurt that person, I don't care it's better to me to hurt that person, even if it harms myself. As opposed to a different thing, which is that, perhaps my way of thinking about my country, my place, perhaps that's passing. Perhaps every generation's way of thinking about it passes. And perhaps I can approach that with a sense of dignity instead of trying to drag the young, with me into, in a sense, my imaginative grave.
Mohsin, thank you so much for just the most wonderfully thought-provoking conversation, and also for your novel, not just this one, but all your novels. This one in particular, 180 pages or so, but full of just such big, big, important ideas. Thank you so much for your book and for this conversation. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Razia, once again. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Razia and Mohsin, so much for such a fascinating conversation. And Mohsin, thank you for your invitation to us all to enter the world of this wonderful novel and use our imagination to interpret it however it occurs to us. That's highly recommended. So now, from all of us at Intelligence Squared, thank you for watching and see you again soon. Good night.